So give me a few seconds here to make sure I have a link for everybody. Okay, here we go. All right, there is the link to folks that are asking for folks who are asking. All right. All right, there is the link
let me
to
shut
folks
off
that
the
are
actual
asking for my video so that I don't hear myself. Folks who are asking. All right. Okay, cool. So, hello. Thank you everybody for coming to the latest lecture. So today, I'm admittedly going to do, I also have the chat up. So if anybody has any questions, I'm looking at my YouTube channel. So please don't hesitate to ask your questions. The way I'm going to do this today is, this is a pretty heavy theoretical chat. I promise it has like practical applications that I'm going to get to, but the beginning of it's a little like ranty, like good ranty, but I just want to let you know what you're in store for. But it's based on some of my work for the past few years, post sort of like my architectural approach to level design work, really looking at, so the lecture is about, as it says on the title, art style and working from design precedents. And we're going to unlock what that means throughout the lecture. But it's really based in a practical, but almost mindful based skill set that comes from like older fields of design than necessarily game development. And, it's something that I want you all to be aware of in your own work, so that you're not making just the same old stuff again and again. I mean, it's an important part of how I've done my own design work. So, I hope that there's something that folks can get out of it. So, is there anybody watching? How can I even see that? Let's see. I don't see anybody on. Oh, 15 watching. Okay, hello 15 people. All right. Yay, there are people here. All right. So, I have a lot of slides, but I'm going to try to get through them really quick. So today, we're here to talk about style. And we're also here to talk about games and art and what art is. So the thing is, like, the best game artists I know have a lot of traditional art experience, but those skills are highlighted far less often than technical skills like rendering or proficiency with Photoshop or 3D, right? And we've created this culture, not within the classroom, but we've created the culture in games that, new designers, they know how to do the software, but a lot of them don't even know how to like draw or use proper proportions. So, I can tell you firsthand, I've seen this in the wild, where somebody will say like, hey, come and look at my awesome thing. And then you see like, oh no, terrifying, horrible, body proportions or architectural layout or something like that. And it's because the person is good at software but doesn't necessarily understand how those other soft skills work. And the problem is that our field de-emphasizes game-making disciplines like, I am a level designer and a game artist. But, you see a lot of people really lean on, when games are published, the designer or people talk about mainly, programming and technical things like that. And then in the serious games area, and that's why I have like the little medical symbol in the one side here. But like in serious games, for example, it's all about what is your theme, what is your game for, instead of like, how's your game constructed, or how's your voice acting, how's your artwork, how's your music. And that's kind of a shame because, the assets of games, all those things that go into a game, they have clear influences from the broader landscape of the arts. A lot of that gets lost because we focus too much on our interactivity or computing power that goes into the graphic or audio fidelity. And even though this course so far has been a lot of game design and game mechanic design, I want to take today to talk about, what does it mean to do art styles, and what does it mean to manage these aspects of your game? Because, I want you to, going into this new project, I want you to see what the project is trying to teach you, and hint, 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 it's not just like 2D engines and pixel art. It's trying to teach you a broader set of skills that I hope that you can carry into, your career and adopt as, a way of thinking. The last project I think had, all projects in this class for my game prototyping class are for that. But this one especially, I think, is like where I hope it really unlocks for folks. So what am I talking about? Like, one of the problems is that, so I said one problem was that we de-emphasize these asset making things because we see them as, I once heard it said by a game designer that the designer was the architect and the artist and programmer and musicians were all the contractors there to like build their vision. And beyond like not really understanding how architecture as a field works, this person also really didn't understand like the role of a game designer and what it means and who these people are that are making game assets. So that's that, the scale image that I had is, it was all weighted towards the one side that didn't treat the asset makers as real professionals. The other thing that I see is that we have a translation error that happens with game art. We conflate skill with programs with artistic knowledge, and that's just not the case. Using the tool well is not being an artist. It's just using a tool well. And I'm kicking myself now because I have this really awful Photoshop image that I grabbed from the internet once a few years ago that is just like throw every filter, throw every blend mode at a picture of a professional football player, and they're like, yeah, check this out. This is my poster. I'm like, oh, please, I hope that's not your poster. Because that's the equivalent of when you hear, oh, web design or graphic design is easy. My high school student knows how to use Photoshop. No. There's a difference between knowing things like proportion and composition and things like that, and knowing software. So there's a bias towards software usage and technical art, but away from studying fine art principles. By the way, to let everybody know, some of these cartoons are images from my 2017 GDC Educator Summit rant. So if anybody's like, hey, wait, I thought I said that to him. No, you didn't. This is from like years ago at a different time. But I mean, these are things that we run into as a teacher is, trying to guide folks towards realizing it's not just about the software. Because if you know software, but you don't know how to do the other art stuff, bad things can happen. Um, so are there any, like, I'm going to address the chat. Are there any questions before going forward? Have I set my table well here? You know what? Let's go back. I'm just going to, until somebody speaks up, I'm going to leave Mega Man up. Terrible Mega Man. Until somebody says, no, God, please go forward. He's beautiful. Don't be mean. That's great. All right. So cool. So that's sort of the problem we're facing, right? So let's break this pattern and talk about games as an art, game art as an art. No, God, please go forward. So really, you know, and I'm not here to do our games art. That we're not doing that. That's very 10 years ago. What really, let's assume games are art and game art is art, but like the question is, what kind of art is it? So what are we looking at for, you know, some takeaways here? You know, I'm going to go through this real quick, but where's the correct slide? Somebody's a little obsessed. So, you know, we're going to look at an art history perspective on game art, an overview of possible trends in indie game art, finding opportunities for reaching artists with existing skills. No, we're all tired. It's all good. Let's see. And then, yeah, I really want to like have an open conversation about art production methods. So first things first, let's talk about genre. And so if you don't know this term, it's a grouping of media based on form, medium, subject matter, or other like organizing common criteria. And when we think of genre, like you might think of something like film, where, you know, or literature, where you look at like different content. So, you know, you have like documentary and popcorn movies and romantic comedies and cartoons and things like that. And then games have the same thing: role-playing games, adventure games, platformers, shooters, things like that. Usually in games based on like what it is you do, what the verbs of the game are. But historically, and this is really important when we talk about, you know, the art of games and art styles. Historically, you know, between the 17th and 19th centuries, there is a period in art where, you know, you would consider it the academic art period in France. And what that means is that there were these art schools, academies, that reinforced styles and rules of art, and you would train in these styles and rules of art with the hopes of becoming a renowned artist. You know, think about this for a second, and it should sound familiar, where you are kind of guided towards very specific types of art with very specific types of media. So these genres were separated not by necessarily style, but often topic. So it had strict rules for how one could create art in each genre. So some of the ones that we're going to look at here: history painting, which are these big epic scenes, religious, historic, or allegorical topics, and they're painted on big canvases. And then you have genre painting, which is like scenes of everyday life. So that's what we're going to look at here. So, you know, again, genre painting, monumental, like multiple feet tall and wide. You know, this is the thing that you walk into the museum and there is a giant wall-size painting. That's what a genre painting was in this academic art style. So if you were to do something on a big canvas that was like a still life, that would actually be considered really controversial according to the genre rules. And you'd be cut out of like traditional Academy events. Well, then there's this artist, Gustave Courbet. He decided, no, I don't like that. I'm going to paint this picture of my uncle's funeral, you know, on a huge canvas. And, you know, it was 24 feet long by 10 feet high. And, you know, this created like a movement that one would call realism, which is, celebrated common events with realistically rendered artwork. So, that was a big deal, that you would take this scene of commoners and create a massive painting out of it. So this act of rebellion, though, if you look at around, I'm not saying that this one painting caused all this, but if you look at this timeline, you're going to notice that you have, look at the number of lines, art styles, by number of dots, centuries. And you're starting to see like a lot of dots clumped and not a lot of, maybe one or two art styles per century. And then suddenly the 19th century hits, and, you have Romanticism, which is coming from this stuff. But then suddenly you get realism mid 19th century, and then we're off to the races. Look at all of those art styles, all those lines, all of a sudden. And then even more so in the 20th century. So, that little act of rebellion opened the floodgates for people to experiment and become more, become less focused on capturing realism and less focused on capturing only specific scenes and more focused on expression, or this is where you get abstraction and graphic design and capturing ideas in their works, making highly personal works, making works that really broke down the walls of this medium. So what does any of this have to do with video games? Well, again, I said, please take a moment to pause and reflect on the current state of game art. And especially you as students, what you are asked to produce and what you're led to believe is good versus, unworthy artwork. So in modern popular video games, it's common to depict scenes of epic setting or scale. And I'm not, ragging on like this amazing piece of artwork from Doom Eternal. Like Doom Eternal is awesome. The Doom series is awesome. I grabbed a highly relevant modern game artwork that actually does happen to have a lot of biblical imagery. So it does fit into this theme. But big industry commercial games, AAA games, utilize exhilaration as a means to elicit fun. In many ways, these are like your history paintings, highly valued by that academic art movement. And I'm going to go back a little bit in time here. Unlike history paintings, these pieces of art can vary in subject. So it's not all, epic scenes with characters. Sometimes you are looking at, mood setting or landscapes or things like that. But you're still doing these big, epic, showy scenes rendered in a realistic style, right? And no matter what they are, think about the way that they're painted. When you do a digital painting, you're painting at a very high resolution. You're painting towards photorealistic standards, and then so that you can reinterpret them within games that are built to best utilize the graphic capabilities of modern consoles. And I realize this game is from, last console, but regardless, I'm really pulling from like the mythology historic painting theme here. So, but you can see how, how this starts to resemble, this like little box that art was once in. So any questions or comments on that? Especially like for those of you watching who are, game design students, which is most of you, I think everybody, unless we got some random followers also joining. But I mean, what do you think about that? I need like some dead air music for when I'm like waiting for chat to catch up, or like the YouTube link to catch up to where I am in real time. And Anybody? I know it's not that far behind. All right, I guess I'm going to continue onward and see if anybody comes and asks a question or has a comment. So as it stands, we have our own limited academy scene in terms of how artists get into the industry. As an educator, I observe the reactions of you all, students, to a culture of exclusivity in game art. Joey Gay, sorry. Somebody says, I think it makes a lot of sense and it's really cool to pull from real life and take real aspects of mythology, but I feel that you get a large influx of the same type of pieces. That's a really good point. Is that, and again, when you get, those mythical scenes, when you're only looking at mythical scenes, you're going to get a lot of the same stuff as opposed to, kind of pulling from something more personal. The layouts of these are very artful. It takes someone who knows what they're doing to create a poster like that. It's true. And I'm not saying that's not skillful. It is skillful, but it's all the same. That's what I want you all to get, is that all of these they're very good. They're very skillful, but they're all the same, and they're all reinforcing a very small set of skills that would then constitute almost like gatekeeping. It's kind of nothing new under the sun if we keep using old standards to create more art. See? So, by using the same standards, this is where we get locked into games are really just about the same old stuff. So how do we break this? And how can we do that? How can we learn how to do this in art style? I mean, this is what this is about. This is about, art direction and style. And I want you to think about not only producing the art, but also defining what the art should be. It's one thing to produce the art. It's another thing to say, I am going to engineer a style, and then from that pick how I want to approach my project. So again, we have a sort of academy in terms of how to get in the industry. I've seen a lot of people face this down, as they get out of school, and it's always really stressful. So I want to, acknowledge that. It's so common. It is in my lecture. So I think this is a problem in the industry that we have to soon address. Lots of you are studying games, but there are too few jobs to accommodate all of you, especially when you are learning these reinforced styles. Now, I know what you're also thinking, but what about that other thing called pixel art? This kind of gets us into that breaking point where somebody said, no, screw this is dumb. And here's where it came from. In the Digital Games Research Association conference paper by scholar Jesper Juhl titled High-Tech, Low-Tech Authenticity, the Creation of Independent Style at the Independent Games Festival, Juhl explores the art history of winning games at the IGF. And what he noticed is that around the time, 2000 through 2000, maybe 4, look at these games. These all have aspects of, except for maybe this 2012 one. But notice all of these have aspects of commercial games. I'm looking at my screen, which is down here, my other screen. They all have aspects of 3D commercial games. And then suddenly, 2005, 2006, and so on and so forth, into even modern times, what you're seeing, and this paper is a few years old, so, that's why it cuts off at 2014. But, notice that the art styles change pretty quickly around 2004. And, so I'm going to ask this to the chat and see if anybody can guess what event in the game industry happened in 2004 that made this change. What made it suddenly turn from trying to be AAA, the kind of things that you had to sell in a box store. I just gave you a clue. What platform came out? Games are still sold on it today. Halo 2 came out. No, it was not Halo 2. Halo 2 had a pretty cool alternate reality game. Somebody has said indie, but boom, Steam. Yes, exactly. Steam happened. So suddenly you're buying games without the need of a brick and mortar store, and you can make your game about anything you wanted. So that's where people started to break out and do these different styles. And again, this is a kind of highly academic reach here, but Yule lines these up. So he observes the transition from AAA like 3D games to retro pixel art. That's the one of the big turns he sees. He contends that pixel art has become, for a lot of designers, a sort of return to the roots of video game graphics, and an effort to recreate the authenticity of the gaming medium. Now, in the 19th century, there was this movement called the arts and crafts movement, and it was focused on creating handmade works as a rebellion against the Industrial Revolution. So, that's sort of the one-to-one that he's saying there. That's the connection he draws. I don't think you need to necessarily know that, insofar, except for understand that we are in the process right now of breaking out of, I always talk about how you can make games without the permission of EA or Activision, right? It's the same thing with self-publishing. This is how, just make things and don't worry about having to make things with those exact AAA skills. You can do anything you want. And again, think back to that timeline of art styles. Once those floodgates were open, people made whatever they wanted. So now pixel art itself has advantages. It can be very beautiful. It can also be accomplished in a very short amount of time. This is some pixel art that I made for Global Game Jam 2014. We were able to crank it out kind of fast and put it in a game really easily, and we were able to do a lot with a little bit of time. And if you are not, quote unquote, the artistic type, this is something that you can. There's a lot of leeway in pixel art that you don't necessarily have to be a good artist, in the way that you have to be a good artist to be a great digital painter. Now, the downside of pixel art is that it's become so popular that it's once was a sign of being unique. Now it's kind of everywhere. And it's become just another way that video games are supposed to look. And they get, I still think games like this get sort of otherized into being oh, well, that's a cute indie. When in fact, these projects take multiple years to produce and are really great games. So, Celeste here is one of the best platformers I've ever played. The other thing with pixel art you have to watch out for is it's become itself a highly managed art style. So, and there's some pushback against this now, but you do have things where people are well, you can't do that. That's not pixel perfect, and other stuff that, we can talk about later. Anyway, so it's not that we need to change pixel art or any of these other styles. It's that we need to change ourselves and get ourselves out of the mindset that graphical horsepower and photorealism equals quality. I found that game name was here. Hand-drawn look took more time. So somebody says hand-drawn look took more time just because of natural complications of each hand-drawn piece in comparison to pixel art. Yeah. So again, each art style has its own different needs and, what we would call affordances, the things that's good and bad at. And so I'm doing a hand-drawn game now, and the hand animation takes forever because you're trying to create a really detailed, smooth character. As opposed to pixel art, like I said, you can get away with a lot. It's very quick. I've made games out of paper cutouts that some of the fastest game art I've ever done, because I'm mainly, just changing the placement of the paper cutouts. So, this is the other side of it, is almost like, when you choose an art style, you really want to not only choose, you want to choose like what fits your goals, but also what's going to allow you to get production done in the same amount of time that you want. And, sometimes that goal does say, like, I want to do this specific art style, and we are okay swallowing that production time. So anyway, as developers, we want to change our attitudes, and the discussion that's already happening in the chat is really awesome. How people are talking about, well, I tried this and I noticed it had this type of time frame to make versus that has that type of time frame to make. That's what you want to get into. This shows that we are changing our attitudes, and that we can start making inventive connections between games and the arts. So, nice picture of Cuphead background artist Caitlin Russell. So, how do we accomplish this? First, let's talk about some theories of game analysis. Here's the academic-y part. So, first is what I've observed as a dominant attitude that, in my opinion, causes a lot of these problems. It's called single work theory. I call it single work theory. It's an approach to studying games that considers them as single, self-contained objects. What do I mean by that? Of course, games are self-contained. They come in a little box, right? Or a big box if you buy the super special edition. Well, so I'm going to lean on film again here. There's this concept called auteur theory in film, which is where film director equals author of film. So in terms of production, single work theory works a lot like auteur theory in film, where you have one person. In games, this is where you get that game designer as architect mindset, right? And they are just directing everybody. And we're in a period where relatively recently people were taking jabs at this kind of idea in games, because in the production of games, a lot of game developers know, and a lot of fans even know, that games are not produced by one person. They are produced by a team of very skilled individuals. And think of being yes, somebody says Todd Howard theory, indeed. But think about in terms of somebody who goes and buys a piece of fan art, right? Or a print of a poster from a game, or a poster of key art from a game, or listens to a game cover band at an event like Fest or on YouTube, right? Or a game orchestra. Think about those things. Those are fan-created works, or fan-created offshoots of, or repackagings of the work that goes into a game. When that MagFest cover band plays something, then they are taking a song from a game and putting it, approaching it by itself, seeing it as its own singular work, instead of presenting all of Earthbound or something like that. And then again, those of you who've studied games for education under me knows that I also am skeptical of seeing games as whole objects, because I think that's the magic wand approach, where it's let's solve the world issue by waving a game at it. Some of those games aren't really engineered to do that. They don't. People are putting games at things that without really thinking about why a game would work in that situation. Which brings us to another thing which collected work theory, which is an approach to studying games. So it's the flip side of this, that considers them as collections of artworks that work together to form an experience. So what do I mean by this? So let's take something like Horizon Zero Dawn, and let's look at so Aloy as a character model, and as a character, and as a piece of design process. Is herself, like, I mean, that 3D model is itself an achievement, right? Aloy is a fantastic character, and we need to acknowledge that project of multiple people that it took to come to that conclusion, of being like, here's Aloy, right? So we can take even just like individual characters and look at them as pieces of art. I'm kind of cheating here. I'm showing the like title card to a GDC level design workshop talk, but the level design and the world design and the quest design, the individual spaces of the game, each of those can be works of art. Those are certainly working from principles of architecture and landscape and things like that. And this isn't a screenshot of, this is not a shot of them recording for this game specifically, but Ashley Birch on the left there is the voice actress for Aloy. And like, is her work not art? Is her acting not relevant? So it's the kind of thing that we want to, and again, I think this is really easy for fans to do. If you've played games, especially modern games, you see these things as individual pieces. But in game criticism, and I don't mean, journalism necessarily, but in games like studies, this sort of seeing them as individual works is not something that's very common, actually. So again, if we go back to the idea that like, so if we accept this as true, we can go back to the idea that assets are themselves works of art and, start to think about like, okay, where do these things come from? What is it about art, fine art, anatomy, all of these things that we study in, if you were an art student, like a fine arts student, how does that go into making a character like Aloy? How does architecture go into a discipline like level design? How does musical composition go into the creation of a soundtrack of a game and become incidental, what you would call incidental music? And if you start to think about these things and you start to acknowledge that there is a link between the world outside of games and games themselves, then you're not making games influenced necessarily only by popular culture and media. And don't get me wrong, I love all these things, but when you make games only from these things and they are only giant epics, they suddenly all look the same. So it's really about, which precedents you use. By the way, if anybody has any, I'm seeing a few like nice Hideo meme, thanks. I worked really hard to find it actually. Because I was like, oh man, which I know that there was a big reaction to the Hideo Kojima game thing, and I'm glad I found that meme because it perfectly encapsulates it. Last fall's discussion. But yes, hard agree, awesome. So any other discussion points, please send them into the chat. That's great. Thank you for being here and participating. So anyway, I'm going to keep going, but I will respond to things in chat. So precedents, right? What do I mean by this? So studying previous... Oh, where'd it go? There you go. Studying previous works of an art to inform your own, right? So this is something that I learned in design school. You want to look at your precedents. And what I want to get out of you is not only considering precedents for games that are other games, which we all do, but also to look in the world outside of games for precedents for either whole games or individual parts of games. So what do I mean by this? Well, first of all, why do you do this? And I think one thing that's really interesting, really one of the big problems is that games come from technology and engineering and software, and the issue with that is that it's very focused on this like patent approach and to originality, where there's suddenly this idea that like, oh, you must be absolutely original in everything you do. Artists have never done that. That has never been a concern for artists. And like, obviously you're not ripping off people's IP, don't get me wrong, but precedent is a thing in fine art and design where you look at something and then you kind of respond to it. Whether that response is, and I think the easy level 1 version of looking at a precedent is, I have to solve a design problem, right? So I'm going to look at works that have solved similar problems to the one that is facing me, and then from looking at their solutions, I will gain insight into what my solution should be. That's how we work from design precedents. But, art precedents might be, like I said, a reaction. You might directly refer to a work in your own work. You might have a work that sets looks a little like something that's come before, but then subverts it in an interesting way. Art reacts to itself. And again, that's not necessarily what technology does. I reference Paper Mario a lot. The simple numbers and mechanics really gave a good baseline to a game more focused on dialogue and art style. Yeah, again, playing, that influences, to the student. And I'm talking in generalities because I don't want to like identify anybody on video that's going to sit on my YouTube channel. As much as I can resist it, I know I've screwed up a few times. So somebody says, I reference Paper Mario a lot. That's awesome. You are identifying elements of that game, simple numbers and mechanics that give a baseline, so allow you to focus on style and dialogue, right? And it's basically what you said. So that game had a balance that you find appealing, and then that is going to help you come up with your own design solutions. That's awesome. That's how this works. So again, don't just use games as influences, though. Look at the world outside of games. So, here's Architecture by Tadao Ando, and here's the game Manifold Garden. And Ando was an influence on the developer of Manifold Garden. And, and there's like a documentary of him reading books about Tadao Ando. So, these are things that you can bring into, whether it be the artistic design of your levels or the logic of how spaces flow into one another, things like that. So, okay. What does this all mean for you? So again, for those in YouTube land who stumble upon this, 3 years after I give it, this is for my game prototyping course. So for those of you in game prototyping, real quick, application to level design, in that if you sit down to design a level with just a core mechanic, you look at games with that mechanic used to influence your level. Exactly. So the idea of, I'm making a game about, pole vaulting. So you're going to go look at like all the other pole vaulting games that have ever been and try to figure out, or that have had pole vaulting, and you think about like, how is pole vaulting going to be used in my game? And this is actually really great because then if there is design precedent, you can then start to like review them or post-mortem them in a way where you can say, well, this one did this really well, but that one didn't do that really well, so I want to change it in this way. And think about the things that you hear from development teams on games like, Spider-Man, right? Marvel's Spider-Man, the developers of that looked at his swing and said, well, we want it to be more like, Spider-Man 2's swing and not like Spider-Man on PlayStation's swing where it's just sort of the monkey bar swing, right? They wanted to do a physics-based thing with reaction time and things like that. So, that is sort of like you're looking at that one's very direct because it's in the same franchise. But yeah, looking at similar core mechanics is, that's how this works. So, again, game prototyping students, how does this work for you? Especially since I am literally telling you to work from other video games. Don't worry, the logic of that has not escaped me. So what am I talking about? Well, in the project, you're studying both the graphic limitations of a bygone console and the types of games that were popular on that chosen console. from that material, like I've given you some material, but you're taking that material and like hopefully turning it into other research, like Wikipedia searches, and I've provided some links to like fan sites for certain consoles and things like that. And I've seen some like videos bouncing around, which are really great, which are like, here's the graphic, here's what so-and-so did with graphics on the Atari, et cetera, et cetera. Keep doing that. Because what you're doing is you're taking all this information and you're putting it in a blender, and you're reducing it down into like the thing that's going to become your game, right? So you're basically you're taking these restrictions, these data points, and you're turning it into what your design is going to be. I'm not handing you a design. I'm not telling you make a platformer that has coins, right? And you're just kind of like putting a skin on it. I want you to come up with what this game is about. So you're studying the in this exercise, you're taking, game design history, and you're learning like how to incorporate game design history into a project. You're learning the skill of art direction. Now, what is that? Art direction, it's not just making the art, and you're going to be making a lot of art because it's a small team, and you're going to work on lots of small teams in your career. But art direction is the person and the skill set of defining the art style, not just saying, oh well, we're making a game, it's got to be photorealistic 3D, because that's what I was trained in, or that's what I took a class in, or something like that. This is you. This is a person who says, well, I'd like it to look like this. And then working backward and saying, okay, if I want it to look like sort of cartoonish 3D, or the 3D equivalent of like a Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon, right? A style that you would call like the cartoon modern, right? You can then work backward and say, well, what shaders do I use? What program should I use? What how do we want to structure and rig our characters for this? It's that skill set, instead of just kind of like saying, oh, I make photorealistic rocks or something like that. So, art direction is the sort of like steering of the boat on, the art of the game, and understanding that, and having the knowledge that it's not just about, doing that one history painting equivalent art style that's like epic photorealism. So platform analysis, you're learning how to look at something and say, okay, here's the limitations of what I'm working in, right? So you're looking at the ZX Spectrum and you're saying, all right, this is what it could do, and this is how my game should feel because of that. And then you're also looking at, again, this goes into design history, but trend analysis. You're looking at a marketplace and you're saying, okay, what kind of games were popular on the thing I chose, on the Commodore 64, on the Neo Geo Pocket Color? What were the trends? What were the design things happening, in the late 90s that, turned into, I'm not saying, by the way, Neo Geo group, that you're going to do this, but like, you might consider, portable console, late 90s, red and blue version, right? And that's not necessarily that you're going to do that, but that's a trend you might entertain. So notice that none of these things are, according to the parameters I've set up for you, you are going to learn a thing like a 2D game engine or pixel art, but that's not really the point. The software just supports these other artistic design goals. And like I said, you come up with the goals first, and then you work backwards into eventually being like, oh, and I'll do that in GameMaker. And that's what I've done in my current project. We started with what our art style should be, and then we started almost shopping for, well, what about this tool? What about that tool? What about that tool? What's going to help us like create the ink comic look that we want, but on the budget that we have. And we eventually decided it based on that. At no point did anybody say, oh, well, I know this, so we must use it. We can it's almost like learn to learn software or learn to learn art styles, and that's how you can become a really effective developer and a really effective like art director. Because again, this is an art direction project. Any thoughts on this? Any questions or anything? And I'm going to ask that. I'm going to learn from my previous awkward pauses, and I'm just going to keep going and respond as people catch up and type stuff into chat. So, this is a skill called design thinking, and I always struggle to use this because at least at the time of this recording, again, allowing for the idea that somebody may watch this years from now, this is kind of a buzzword, and that makes it kind of icky, and I don't like that because this is a theme that I heard from instructors when I was learning that I thought was really compelling, and that I like to keep using. So, let's ignore for right now that Stanford has kind of turned it into this like design thinking buzzword thing, and let's look at what it means. So it's the ability to synthesize disparate bodies of knowledge or bits of information into a single product or solution. So what does that mean? For one thing, and you've all done design projects by now. This is sort of, by the way, I'm going to throw this out there. Anybody that tells you that design is using the software, like, look at me, I'm designing. I'm using AutoCAD or something like that. That's not design. That's using software. Design is the like mental cognitive act of creating solutions to problems, whether that be designing a good coffee mug or water bottle or teapot, or I'm using a lot of drinking vessels, or like video game that's about something or not about something. That's design. It's creating solutions. It's not using software. Software is just the tool with which we enact our design. But if you think that's as far as it goes, then that's not really design. There's lots of people who just do high level use of it, but that's not really what I want for you. I want you to understand how this works at a cognitive level. So at what point do you expand to other software for game development? For example, if I'm familiar with Unity and can develop quickly in it, why would I go to a program like GameMaker? That's an excellent question. So the reason that there are multiple reasons to try different tools. One is that, so I'm going to throw this one out there. You have no reason to be loyal to a piece of software unless they start paying you to be. And that's like a very practical answer. But, and I like certain pieces of software. I like Unity. I like Unity a lot. I love Blender. I think Blender's great. But, there are things that I don't like about those pieces of software that I think can be covered by other pieces of software better. So, so over the course of a career, like I've learned a lot of things and swapped out. So for example, like let's say you get really good with Unity, but you acknowledge that Unity has its like eccentricities, right? And again, like I'm kind of in that situation where I'm like a pretty good Unity developer. I can't script all the way through with it. I usually work with somebody, but I can do pretty well with Unity. Sometimes like Unity, for example, and not to pick on it just as an example, is like just too big for the thing that I'm trying to do. I made a game that I was easily able to create. My design had like a bunch of basically like very standard mechanics that I didn't really need to have that much tight control of. But the art style and the presentation was really different. And, for that, because again, I didn't want to spend a ton of time hammering out these like very basic things, I just used Construct it's not that I couldn't use other things, but it was because like Construct had a lot of that stuff already pre-made. So it was a few clicks and then I was working on my game, right? Whereas I would probably have had to like write some of that stuff from scratch, and it didn't really seem worth my time, in the time frame that I'd set for myself to like do anything else. If you're on a budget and schedule, shouldn't you use the software you're most efficient with? That's part of the consideration that you come up with, So, and don't conflate. The one thing that I want to say is don't conflate what you're familiar with necessarily efficiency, because you also should look at, I guess, and to go back to my Construct example, learning time. Somebody that's used a game engine before can learn something like Construct in about an hour, or Twine or something like that. And, if that's the scope of what your project is, you're less likely to run into the kind of problems that you would get with, a bigger engine like Unity, or, let's pick on another engine now, Unreal. An Unreal file by its very nature is going to be several gigabytes unless you start like really whittling it down. But sometimes those games are just, it's like, why does this need to be this way? And you might consider for like memory management purposes, something that doesn't structure its files so beefy. I want Photoshop tattooed on my forehead, but I acknowledge it is kind of garbage. Well, remember, all of them are garbage. It's just some of them are less garbage than others. We had this conversation in our design meeting about like the paradigm of Photoshop versus GIMP, and like GIMP, why are you trying to be so different for reasons that don't make sense? Yeah, everything is not the perfect solution, when it comes to software. And that's why I really encourage you to be open with your software choices and not really get married to any of them. Because again, what's the point of being so enthusiastic as to be an evangelist for something unless this is like a cynical reason, like to me, the only evangelists should be the people who are paid by the company that makes the software to go out and give a talk on why their software is the best. But otherwise, like I think, and this comes from being around for a while, the other reason not to get too married to some of these, and I realize it's kind of silly, this is a hard abstract thing to talk about when you're thinking about like Photoshop, but when it comes to game engines especially, I've seen so many game engines come and go, where like, Torque used to be a thing, but now Torque is no longer a thing. So it's the kind of, with game engines especially, I tell people like, don't get attached to them. It's the same reason people got worried when like Unity is going up for its initial public offering. Like once it becomes tradable, what's going to happen to it or its licensing and things like that. So anyway, so design thinking is when you are like, again, outside of its buzzwordness, you're one is wrangling different types of knowledge into one place, like, right? So you are mentally organizing, okay, this I'm going to use architecture as an example. I need to build a building, but I need to I need to build this building within the criteria listed by the site conditions and the building codes and what the client wants and what the budget is and what, who the contractors we can get are. And you've got to like take all of those things and come up with the solution to the problem. You've got to come up, it's like a puzzle, a resource management puzzle. And that's one part of design thinking. But, you can also look at it like, I have this thing and I want these aesthetic elements from it, and I want it to, convey this type of information. So it doesn't have to just be restrictions. It can be lots of, learning how to work with precedents and learning how to work with references and make a really interesting piece of media. Again, when you're working in a field that doesn't have building codes. So design thinking doesn't just have to be the scary part. It can also be synthesizing fun parts. And I'll show you some examples of what that might be. So one of my own professors put it this way when he was telling us about the experience of being an architect. My favorite thing about being an architect is that if I'm doing, for example, a hospital project, I get to learn about doctors and what they do during their day and how to make that easier. So if you can synthesize the needs of a project, the client, the platform, or even an art movement that you think is interesting, and you kind of put it all into one melting pot, and that becomes like the stew that is your game or your project, you can make games about any work or concept, and that can help you make your work more unique. And that way you're not just making, fantasy game 847. So it's like, what if you want to make games about abstract art? And this is the game that I was talking about with Construct, where I was like, I could do it in Unity, and these would be simple things to code, but it was a perfect thing for a free game. And it took me only 3 months. So, and this is a weird example too, because like this game, it's that little game I made 5 years ago, but I feel like every year and a half or so, it pops up in like some way where either somebody wants to use it in a gallery or somebody like references it in a video about like modern art or something like that. And again, just because you know the big thing doesn't mean you always have to work in the big thing. Sometimes you just like want to get something out, and that's okay. Little things are great for just getting things out. It does, you're showing off. Don't just think you have to show off your skill with Unreal. Because again, if we go back, I'm not going to go all the way back, but if we go back to those early slides, everybody thinks it's about showing off your tech skills. It's not. It's about showing off these skills of like, are you a clever designer? Remember, design is not using the tech. The tech is just a tool. So like, what if you want to make a game about transcendentalism? And this is made in a more sophisticated 3D engine, but the gameplay, so this is Walden by Tracy Fullerton and the USC Game Innovation Lab. But, this game has specific gameplay about being, mindful and living off the land and things like that. Or, do you want to make a game about literature? What's that like? Again, I know Unity, but the card game felt right. That was the game I wanted to make. That's the way that I said, like, oh, I could make the entirety of this giant novel if I made it into a card game. In case you can't tell, I'm alternating other people's work in and out because I don't want it to just be about me or anything. That would be weird. Or like the development of language. So Dialect by Beth Lepenzi and Thorny Games. This is a role-playing game it's a book and a deck of cards about language and the development of languages and the life of languages. And again, sure, it probably could be a video game, but why? Maybe you want to have it be something else. Or an old comic strip. We kind of had it out amongst ourselves. So this is the game that we did say we want to have this comic book style, and then we worked backwards, right? We could probably make a 3D platformer of this, and that could be cool, but, we set ourselves a different set of goals, and we've felt really fulfilled with it so far. And it uses a combination of like some Photoshop, and other, 2D software, some open source stuff, but, also good old Photoshop. But then also we're using the Blender 2.8 2D animation suite just because it allowed us to do everything we wanted for free, but also get like the ink and paint look. So all these sprites are being done in Blender, and it looks just like the artwork from the original comic strip. Or even your family history. So like this is a 3D game again, but it was done like it's a very small scale 3D environment, and it's you're exploring this house both in modern times, but as it existed throughout the developer's grandmother's life. So again, where it comes in with your project is that I don't want you to think of this project as this is my pixel art project or this is my retro game project. It is to the extent that it will have pixel art and it will be a retro game, but it's hopefully this and all the other projects that you've worked on are showing you that, take a step back to realize the soft skills you develop from these, because I don't give a crap if you learn Twine or Game Maker or pixel art or whatever. What I care about is that you learn how to look at the goals that you set yourself for a game. And I want you to basically have good goals. I don't want you to say, I want to make a game, and then you just start making the same old junk in Unreal. And I'm not bashing Unreal. I'm just saying this is what young designers tend to do, is they tend to fall so hard on what they were trained in. And of course and I understand that you put all your time into learning these things and all that mental stress and energy from being in classes to train in these things. But remove yourself from that for a second and realize that they're just brushes in a toolbox or in a painter's box. They're just pencils. Don't think of them as these scary big things, because that's not the knowledge of being a game designer. The knowledge of being a game designer is learning how to set a set of goals for a project, whether that goal be an experience or being something that you want the person to learn, or whether it be a story you want to tell, or whether it be a feeling or an emotion that you want them to have, or even just to make something beautiful. And then you start to look at what tools are available to you, and you make a decision based on a number of factors. Part of them are practical ones like budget or skill or speed, but other ones are things like, is this going to give us the effect that will help us accomplish this thing that we want? Sure, maybe I can use X piece of software because I've used it a bunch and I'm very fast with it, but it has these memory issues and it makes really big file sizes, and I don't really need all that beefy power, but I can learn that other thing in an hour, and then that'll help me accomplish it faster in that way. These are all things you take into account, but focus on those experience. With Project 3, I'm giving you the set. I want you to look at what is the art style of this thing? What do these visuals look like? And then I want you to set that as your aesthetic goals. So that's teaching you how to analyze and understand an aesthetic art style. And it's a really, it's an easy one to interpret because it is here's the graphical processing power of an old console. But, that at least trains you in seeing that's an art. I don't want you to think of it as graphic power. I want you to think of it as art style. So learn the art style, and then you're also learning what was popular, what kind of experiences did people have on this thing, not just what could it do, but ZX Spectrum Group, you're looking at a lot of British surrealism and weird games because it's all a bunch of people that were watching way too much Monty Python. SNK, Neo Geo people, that's a lot of fighting games and action games because that's SNK is this arcade company. So, and Commodore 64 people, that's a lot of RPGs because that's a lot of where people were going to make their games in BASIC to make their role-playing games, their Bard's Tales and blanking on everything that was on Commodore 64, King's Quest and wastelands and things like that. So you see, these are experiences. They're not just like graphics, right? I want you to work backwards from those and then say to yourself, okay, now what's going to be the tool set that I'm going to work in? And yeah, it's a semester, you don't have a ton of time. You're either going to go to the game maker because somebody's familiar with it. I know some people are doing Unreal because that's what you've been trained in and it's familiar. But like, think about this mindset. If, there were like, someday there might be a version 2 of this class, right? Where instead of an old game console, I give you a artist or an art movement and I say make that video game, right? And that's where it's the same mindset. It's the same, like, okay, I have this piece of art. What are the verbs in the art? There's my gameplay. What are the visual elements of these pieces of art? That's my style, right? That's where you're going to do that important backward work of saying, okay, what will help me get to this point where I make interactive artwork? And that's design. That's art direction. That's making your own choices, and that's making games that are really unique. Because as Chris Melisinos, friend of mine, game developer, also curator of the Art of Video Games exhibit from 2012 at the Smithsonian, he says, "It is the best of what we can do with art, all wrapped up into something that becomes greater than its parts. Within games, we have illustration, sculpture, musical scoring, narrative, and poetry." And it's kind of, don't waste that by just being like, oh, I'm just going to make it in, this one thing, or I'm only going to do it photorealistic. Some of you, that might be the dream. You want to work for the company that makes the big photorealistic games, and that's okay. But don't think that's all you have to make, and don't think that's what you're limited to do only because, somebody says that's what jobs are. Again, as with anything, go get that job. Go try to pursue that job. But also know that you have the permission to go and make different things and make weird things and use that skill of design thinking to, throw a bunch of influences at games. Because that's when this medium gets really cool and interesting, is when you can start to take all these things that aren't just nice 3D models and like make something really awesome. So that's all I have. What do you all think? Tell me in the comments. Like and subscribe. Or don't. I'm gonna wait for everybody to catch up. Uh-oh. Clicking around. Need to refine my window. There you are. This class can basically just be called Soft Skills 101. Yes. Yes, this is the class where I want to hammer all of the soft skills of game making into you. Because I want you to see it's soft skills. Yeah, I mean, it's like our guest speaker said last week. If you're looking at a junior artist position, the assumption is you're not necessarily coming in as a highly skilled user of software, and like certainly that's a bonus, but like it's nice when a company doesn't have to train you from scratch, obviously, but it's also a big part of like, can they work with you? Do you understand how games are made and what the process is and what the start to finish parts of this are? Do you understand, like, do you have a good eye for proportion or eye for animation? Do you have a good knowledge of, with level design, for example, like, do you have a good knowledge of how spaces flow into one another and architectural design principles? I was even reminded of something that I had written about where I'm going to give a talk at a college in like next week, and they're going to ask me a question about like served versus service spaces, which is a concept that comes from the architect Louis Kahn. And I even had to look it back up again because I was like, oh, I did say that, didn't I? But it is like, served spaces being like a main focal point, and service spaces being spaces that ultimately like assist that space somehow, whether it be funnel people to it or be a space that provides some resource to that main space. Think in terms of a game map. You have your main focal points of, like, let's say for a deathmatch map, places where people are probably going to do the lion's share of their fighting, and then you have other serving spaces like spawn points and hallways and places where to get ammo and stuff that moves people through, or maybe even provides other like snipers' nests and other ancillary things. Understanding those kinds of things, how to lay out space like that, makes you a better level designer. So, take the time, and I know it's hard. Like, that's the thing about teaching game design, but like also learning game design, is that like you have so much pulling at your attention, and these programs do not help because they're big and beefy and scary and bad. But they pull your attention, and I hope, for your sake, like, I don't know, go catch some fish on your Animal Crossing island, and then like take some time to really like ponder that, it's not just about these tools. Get yourself in like that good headspace where you can be like, you know what, I can sit back and like putter around in something for like 15 minutes and see if I get it. I did that last week with Sprite. I haven't had a chance to really use Sprite that extensively, and I had need of making that little owl sprite for our poster, for our event, for our class. And I said, what if I just did it in Sprite? I can kind of click around until I figure it out. And then I did, and now I know Sprite, and it was great. So, if you're okay with that kind of thing, like I said, it can be intimidating, but, having that mindset will get you. It's gotten me to the point where I actually made something instead of worrying about learning the skills to eventually someday make something, if that makes sense. And then also learn to work with people. Okay, any other questions? I'm really glad that I positioned my top of my YouTube window so that it doesn't cut off the text there. That's very nice. Okay, seems pretty quiet in chat. I am going to stop streaming now, but thank you for watching. This was great. I've got no other questions. Well, thank you for the awesome questions. This was awesome. I said awesome twice. That's how awesome it was. All right, I will see you later. Be safe and well, everybody. And make awesome things.